Welcome to the Haynes Report. I'm Carol Haynes. In today's show, I'm discussing Biden's executive order to advance equity. This is going to create a reign of terror unlike anything Americans have ever known. How and why is this being done, and what can we do about it? On February 16th, Joe Biden signed his second executive order on racial equity to supposedly root out systemic racism in the federal government and to advance racial equity. But here's the fact. DEI, which is acronym for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, is the leftist cover to transform the American government, our federal government, into a woke Marxist DEI industry. Now, the most extreme practices of radical woke college campuses will be embedded within every single area of the federal government to replace our Constitution and our laws, just so they can punish and segregate Americans based on their race, their ancestry, and their gender. And all of this is being done through Biden's executive order, not through congressional law. Susan Rice, you may remember her name. She was Obama's go-to girl. Well, now she's Biden's domestic policy advisor, and she's going to lead a White House Equity Steering Committee that will, quote, coordinate government-wide efforts to advance equity, end quote. The executive order, titled Further Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the Federal Government, is supposed to get rid of systemic barriers that keep non-whites back from prospering. This means barriers by whites. Here's the bottom line. Rice's job is to embed equity into every single agency to transform them into a neo-socialist state that will totally control everything: our workforce, education, medical, energy, finance, legal, housing, military, transportation, national security, and social security. These efforts to incorporate equity pose extreme danger for us, the American people. Biden's new executive order also directs all federal agencies to favor, quote, underserved communities and to provide them with special treatment. The order lists a number of favored groups who are going to get federal government preferences. These groups that are said to face discrimination, they say they face discrimination. This group includes non-whites, LGBT, pregnant women, religious groups, and immigrants. For example, when dealing with urban areas, these favored groups will be able to get private capital or loans. Well, whites need not apply, of course. Biden's order opens the floodgates of federal money, our tax money, to illegal aliens who invade our nation and get to live in expensive hotels while some Americans are homeless. Likely pregnant women who want abortions are going to get preferential government treatment. Well, we can be sure that the religious groups that they're going to give preferential to do not include Christianity. Biden's executive order uses three key strategies to set up this woke Marxist DEI industry. The first strategy: each department will have an equity czar with a team to plan and implement DEI. The second strategy is that there will be government funding for third-party political activist organizations who align with government goals. And the third strategy is the continued weaponization of the civil rights law to advance their Marxist ideology. Within the next 30 days, federal agency heads must establish agency equity teams. This is what they're calling them. And they're going to create equity action plans. Those teams are going to implement equity initiatives. Well, the agency equity teams will include the Departments of State, Treasury, Defense, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health, and Human Services, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, the Small Business Administration, the Social Security Administration, the General Services Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Science Foundation, and the Office of Personnel Management. So you can see when I said it includes all of the federal bureaucracy, it is massive and this is extensive. In addition to delivering equitable outcomes, the executive order charges agency heads with conducting ongoing equity training and equity leadership development, and to embed equity into everything the agency does. These equity czars are required to provide annual reports so the government can monitor the progress made by the agency on the actions, the performance measures, and the milestones, and this is the words of the order, going to monitor them about how well they are embedding equity into government-wide processes. Each agency will be under close government scrutiny through massive data collection just to be sure that they're properly advancing equity and very aggressively. Here's another term that the executive order mentions, gender equity. Well, we know that gender equity means transgenderism, and this will be aligned and embedded across federal agencies and pushed into the American culture on a vastly bigger scale. Now, we've been talking about this being a big part of how the children are being radicalized and destabilized in our schools, especially our public schools. Well, now, even though parents are trying to get this out of the public schools, now it's going to come from top down. And remember, I said that one of the departments was the Department of Education. So now, how are you going to get it out of the public schools when it's coming from the top down, and that federal money is going into public schools? Are the schools going to say, no, I don't want to take the federal money? And if they take the federal money, then they've got to really push transgenderism into these schools. How is that going to work? Climate equity is another equity that's mentioned in this executive order of Biden's. Now, that's another word for wealth redistribution. It's a cover term for wealth redistribution. This is going to be advanced at the federal level. And we know what climate is all about. This is all environmentalism, and the earth is getting so hot. Well, I'm not even going into that. This is not the time to get into a discussion on the climate, but just know that they're really going to be pushing this now at the federal level. Artificial intelligence and automated systems, this is AI, and automated systems will be designed and used to expand these neo-socialist goals into the entire fabric of the American economy and our society. The second strategy that is being used by this executive order to push equity throughout the federal government is the funding of third-party private groups. This is a very strategic play because our Constitution, our laws have placed limits on what the federal government can do or cannot do. Civil rights laws limit federal employee activity, while the civil service laws ban partisan political activism. Well, the public, you and I, can fill out a form called a Freedom of Information Act request. It's an FOIA, and I know there are a number of you who have filed these. We can do this when they're public agencies. However, we cannot file these on private organizations. Well, Biden's order allows circumvention of this with a very clever mandate to identify funding opportunities for community and faith-based organizations working in and with underserved, that's third quote, underserved communities to improve their access to benefits and services for members of these underserved communities. Well, by funding these aligned third-party organizations that are both political and partisan, because they are private and they are aligned with government goals, then these government goals can be achieved at arm's length within the private sector without the scrutiny of us conservative watchdogs. We can't file an FOIA on these private organizations. The leaders of these advocacy groups fly under the false banner of helping, quote, the underserved in order to disguise their real agenda of pushing socialism into our country, including transgenderism out into the communities, again, coming down from money from the federal level, pushing transgenderism throughout the fabric of our society. Here's the third strategy of the executive order of Biden. The third strategy that this order is using is to embed equity within the federal government by continuing to weaponize the civil rights law. Well, as you know, the 14th Amendment provides equal treatment under the law without discrimination on the basis of race or identity, supposedly. This has been hijacked by the left wing and used to racially segregate white students. Now, in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, only certain racial groups need apply for scholarships. DEI statements, remember that's diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, have been routinely used for at least a decade, at least since the year 2010, by colleges to discriminate in hiring. Now, they will deny that, but if you'll go back and look at what is in that, then you will understand that they really have been discriminating. So that very few conservatives now are in colleges and universities. How does the left wing get away with this flagrant violation of the Civil Rights Act? Because they have hijacked the civil rights bureaucracy and they're all in it together. We have been forewarned that the government intends to use the civil rights law to discriminate against whites. If you go to this executive order and go down to Section 8, it's titled Affirmatively Advancing Civil Rights. And those agencies are required to prevent and address discrimination and advance equity for all. This is a brand new twist on affirmative action. Now, if you remember, affirmative action has been around for a number of years to discriminate against whites. If blacks were coming in for a job, it didn't matter as long as they were black. This was affirmative action. Now, this is a new twist on this affirmative action. This is a throwback to the Jim Crow era, the class hatred of Stalin's policies, and the dogmatism of Mao's Cultural Revolution. And this was how America First Legal identified it, as noted in their press release, and I'll talk about that a little bit further down in our conversation. Biden's executive order requires the government to use AI, artificial intelligence, and automated systems to, quote, prevent and remedy discrimination, including by protecting the public from algorithmic discrimination. Now, that word algorithmic is very important. And to deploy AI systems in a manner that advances equity. The real purpose of AI will be to promote racial division and discrimination. The executive order requires federal agencies also to coordinate with community organizations. Now, this is unconstitutional. Again, this is an overreach of what our Constitution allows the government to do. So, I've talked about these three strategies. Now let's talk about the executive order advancing equity and what it's really all about. Again, when you look at this executive order, and I hope you'll go in and read it, it's quite shocking. Section 10, go to Section 10, and it defines equity as this: the consistent and systematic treatment of all individuals in a fair, just, and impartial manner, including individuals who belong to communities that often have been denied such treatment. Now, this is the big cover-up for what Biden and his henchmen are really up to. In their press release, America First Legal, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, gives a much different definition than what the executive order gives for equity. And here is their definition. Equity is a euphemism for discrimination based on race, national origin, sex, or economic class with respect to employment, university missions, and access to government benefits, programs, or services. As applied, equity is nothing more or less than a rebranding and reorientation of the racism in the Jim Crow era, the class hatred in Stalin's anti-Kulak policies, and the dogmatism of Mao's Cultural Revolution, end quote. The Marxist axiom is that the United States cannot get rid of systemic racism until there is equity based on racial categories. The Marxist definition of equity is this: equal outcome. They demand equal outcomes for the underserved or underrepresented communities, even though achieving equal outcomes requires coercion against other groups of people. Now, we know it's impossible for everyone to have equal outcomes. They don't have equal education, they don't have equal intelligence, they don't have equal income, they don't have equal anything else, they don't have equal goals, and they don't all live in the same house. This is stupidity. We cannot have equal outcomes, but we can have equality. And what is equality? It is equal opportunity, and that's what America is about, equal opportunity. And if people choose not to take their part in equal opportunity, then they can't expect to have an equal anything else. They can't expect to have as much income as someone else who has really worked to take advantage of that equal opportunity that this great country has given us. Marxists hold that until the U.S. achieves this impossible equity, America will continue to be racist. Now, how impossible is that, and how lunatic is that? Therefore, to achieve equity, they must get rid of the racist system, including our Constitution, our laws, our heritage, our history, our cities, our buildings, our statutes, literally everything, to completely obliterate the U.S. down to the ground. But these Marxists know that equity is impossible. It's simply a disguise for their power grab to turn the U.S. into a socialist nation. Simply put, equity is the goal of DEI. Equity is the rebranding of socialism with a government-planned economy. And you've heard that word before, government-planned economy. That is collectivism. And this rebranding of this with this government-planned economy purports to create equal outcomes through diversity and inclusion. The left intends to enforce equity. They intend to use radical leftist DEI officers, you could call them commissars, to censor and remove dissidents and to enforce equity. That's neo-socialism. And by driving them out, these officers are these diversity czars with their superior intellect. They're so smart. They alone can determine who should be included and who should be excluded. This is how they will justify their purging and their censoring of ideas and speech and of people who fail to toe the party line of equity. Inclusion means they intend to enforce the neo-socialism of the United States. Well, will there be a new name when we become a totalitarian or communist nation? There is going to be massive discrimination against whites. Mark my words, this will be unlike anything we have ever known in this country. There will be massive discrimination against anyone else who dares to criticize this government or refuses to go along with the radical equity agenda. Think about those people who have been in prison over the January 6th, quote, insurrection, still in prison. This is totally unheard of in America. This sounds like a third world nation, a communist nation. Whites are going to be segregated. We're going to be denied services, jobs, the ability to go to college. We won't be able to get loans, forget housing, forget ownership of anything. We're told that we will be so happy that we don't own anything. Even cars will be an issue, being able to have cars. Christians will be persecuted and we will be excluded. CRT celebrity Ibram Kendi puts the matter much more bluntly, and I'm quoting him. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination, end quote. We see this discrimination against whites daily in our news. Now, this morning there appeared an article about the Los Angeles Times commentary informing us that white drivers are polluting the air breathed by LA's people of color. So now Whitey, whose real perfidy knows no bounds, is breathing free and easy and leaving the poor non-whites gasping for breath. This was written by some lunatic white man who believes all of this garbage. With DEI now at the national level through our federal government, we can expect the persecution of whites to grow increasingly worse. We can expect DEI statements, which are simply loyalty oaths, to be required in every area of American life, with the diversity officers, enforcing them through inclusion, or should we say exclusion. America is disintegrating into anarchy. Implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion at the federal level will trigger a reign of terror, a tyranny unlike anything we Americans have ever known. Where is the outrage on this? Where are the Republicans to stop the funding of this executive order? It can't continue if the funding is cut off. Well, considering how rhino Republicans have just gone ballistic in criticizing Tucker Carlson for exposing the truth about this January 6th so-called insurrection in D.C., it's going to take grassroots getting engaged, just as we've been doing in education, to stop this mad rush to socialism and our descent into full-blown communist nation. We have to get engaged. Everyone has to get engaged. This is the Haynes Report, and I'm Carol Haynes. Thank you for joining me today. Please check out my website, www.drcarolhaynes.com.